The spotlight dims on Madison Square Garden's stage. 15,000 screaming fans fade into memory. But in a cramped backstage room that smells of cigarette smoke and old guitar cases, Ace Frehley sits cross-legged on a battered road case, his silver Les Paul resting against his knee. Across from him, a nervous 19-year-old kid with calloused fingers and dreams bigger than his worn-out Stratocaster trembles slightly. The kid doesn't know it yet, but this moment, this unscheduled, unpublicized 30-minute conversation will change the trajectory of his entire musical career. And he's not alone. What the world never saw, what the cameras never captured, what the magazines never reported, was that behind the Space Ace makeup and the pyrotechnic spectacle, Ace Frehley was quietly building an army of guitar heroes, one backstage lesson at a time. The story everyone knows goes like this. Ace Frehley, lead guitarist of Kiss, the mysterious Space Ace who conquered stadiums with smoking guitars and otherworldly solos. But there's another story, one that lived in the shadows of arena corridors, in late-night phone calls to unknown numbers, in handwritten notes tucked into guitar cases. Between 1978 and 1995, Ace Frehley personally mentored, advised, or taught over 300 aspiring guitarists, most of whom he'd never met before and would never see again. No publicity, no cameras, no contracts. Just a man who remembered what it felt like to be hungry for knowledge, standing outside the music that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. Before we dive deeper into this incredible untold chapter of rock history, if you're discovering these hidden stories for the first time, please subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to bringing you the authentic, behind-the-scenes moments that shape the legends you love. Hit that notification bell, because we have more of Ace's secret history coming soon. The pattern started in 1978, right after Ace's solo album had shocked the entire music industry by outselling the other Kiss members' releases. New York Groove was climbing the charts, and suddenly Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx wasn't just the cool, mysterious fourth member of Kiss anymore. He was a legitimate solo star. But success didn't change what his mother had taught him growing up in that small apartment on Marion Avenue. When you have something others need, you share it. And what Ace had was knowledge, technique, and most importantly, time. The first unofficial student appeared almost by accident. Detroit, Michigan, Joe Louis Arena, March 1979. A local opening band had just finished their set, and their lead guitarist, a 22-year-old named Marcus Webb, was packing his gear when Ace walked past. Something made Ace stop. Maybe it was the way Marcus handled his Gibson SG with reverence, but also frustration. Maybe it was the look in his eyes that Ace recognized from his own mirror in 1972. Whatever it was, Ace turned around and said 5 words that would become his signature opening line for hundreds of these encounters. "Let me show you something." For the next hour, while his bandmates did press interviews and the crew loaded equipment, Ace sat with Marcus in an empty dressing room and taught him the secret to his signature vibrato technique. Not the showy, surface-level stuff that fans saw on stage, but the actual mechanical finger positioning, the emotional intent behind each bend, the way you had to feel the note before you played it. Marcus Webb never became famous. His band broke up 6 months later. But he went on to teach guitar in Detroit for 35 years, and every single student he taught learned Ace Frehley's vibrato technique. That's over 2,000 guitarists carrying Ace's DNA in their playing, and most of them don't even know where it originated. But here's where the story gets fascinating, where it transforms from a nice anecdote into something that actually shaped the sound of rock music in the 1980s and 90s. Because Marcus wasn't unique. He was the first ripple in what would become a tidal wave. Word started spreading in the underground guitarist community, passed in hushed tones at music stores and rehearsal studios. If you can get backstage at a Kiss show, if you can find Ace before the performance or after the encore, if you're brave enough to approach him with genuine respect and honest questions, he'll teach you. And unlike other rock stars who might sign an autograph and disappear into their tour buses, Ace would sit down, pull out his guitar, and actually show you the techniques that took him years to develop. The mythology grew, but so did something even more remarkable. Ace started giving out his personal phone number, not to everyone, not randomly, but to the young guitarists he met who reminded him of himself, the ones who had the hunger but lacked the guidance. Throughout the early 1980s, there existed an informal network of aspiring rock guitarists who all had the same carefully guarded secret, a phone number that connected directly to Ace Frehley's home in Connecticut. And Ace answered, sometimes at 2 a.m, sometimes in the middle of watching television, sometimes right before heading to the studio. One of those calls changed rock history in ways that most people still don't fully understand. The year was 1983. Ace had recently left Kiss, and he was home more often, working on what would eventually become his solo projects. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. On the other end was a nervous 20-year-old from Los Angeles named Tracy, who had gotten the number from a guitarist friend who'd met Ace in Cleveland. Tracy was struggling with a specific technique, trying to blend blues-based rock with the emerging heavy metal sound. For 45 minutes, Ace walked him through pentatonic scale variations, explaining how to add chromatic passing tones to create tension, how to use space and silence as effectively as notes. Tracy thanked him, hung up, and used those exact techniques on his band's demo tape 3 weeks later. That band was Guns N' Roses, and while Tracy didn't make the final lineup, his playing on that early demo influenced the guitarist who did, Slash. Slash himself has mentioned in interviews over the years that he learned from older guitarists in the LA scene, but rarely specified names. According to those who were part of that ecosystem, one of those influential figures was Ace Frehley, not through direct mentorship with Slash, but through the techniques and approaches that circulated through the community of guitarists Ace had helped. It's like musical DNA, passed from generation to generation, mutating slightly with each transmission, but maintaining that core Ace Frehley essence. The combination of blues feeling with rock power, the strategic use of effects, the understanding that showmanship and substance weren't enemies, but partners. But perhaps the most profound of these hidden relationships was with Darrell Abbott, who the world would come to know as Dimebag Darrell of Pantera. 1985, Dallas, Texas. Pantera was still years away from becoming the metal juggernaut that would define an era. They were a struggling glam metal band playing clubs that smelled of stale beer and broken dreams. Ace was in Dallas for a solo show, promoting his work outside of Kiss. After the performance, Ace did what he always did. He hung around the venue, signed autographs, talked to fans, and that's when he met 17-year-old Darrell. What happened next was witnessed by only a handful of people, but its impact would echo through decades of heavy metal history. Darrell approached Ace with a beaten-up guitar and asked, not for an autograph, but for advice on how to develop a unique sound. Most rock stars would have offered a platitude and moved on. Ace invited Darrell onto his tour bus. For the next 3 hours, as the crew packed equipment and the venue lights went dark, Ace taught Darrell the philosophy that had guided his own musical journey: authenticity over imitation. Ace showed him how to take influences and digest them completely, breaking them down into their component parts, and then rebuilding them into something entirely your own. More specifically, Ace demonstrated his approach to harmonics, both natural and artificial, and how to use them not as gimmicks, but as expressive tools. He explained his philosophy on guitar tone, that elusive quality that separates memorable players from technically proficient ones. And he told Darryl something that the younger guitarist would repeat in interviews for the rest of his life. The guitar is just wood and wire until you put your soul into it. Don't play what you think people want to hear. Play what makes you feel something, and they'll feel it too. Darryl took that lesson and created a sound that defined an entire subgenre of metal. And until his tragic death in 2004, Dimebag Darrell cited Ace Frehley as one of his primary influences, not just musically, but philosophically. The beautiful tragedy of their relationship was that it came full circle. In the late 1990s, when Ace was going through some of his darkest personal struggles, fighting demons that had haunted him since his Kiss days, Dimebag reached out. The student became the supporter, phone calls at midnight, words of encouragement, a reminder that the lessons Ace had given freely were now returning as lifelines. When Dimebag was murdered on stage in 2004, Ace was devastated. At the funeral, he was seen holding Dimebag's signature guitar, tears streaming down his face, surrounded by several other guitarists who had all been touched by Ace's generosity. It was a moment that crystallized the impact of those hidden lessons, those unpublicized mentorships, those late-night phone calls that no magazine ever covered. So what exactly did Ace teach in these sessions? What was the content of these legendary lessons that influenced so many careers? Unlike formal music education with its scales and theory, Ace's approach was intuitive, emotional, and deeply practical. He focused on three core principles that he'd developed during his years with Kiss and his solo work. First, tone production. Ace was obsessed with the idea that your sound should be identifiable within 3 notes. He taught aspiring guitarists how to achieve that through a combination of picking attack, finger pressure, and amplifier settings. He'd demonstrate by playing the same lick through different tonal approaches, showing how the emotional content changed completely based on those variables. Second, the relationship between rhythm and lead playing. Ace believed that many guitarists made the mistake of thinking lead work was separate from rhythm. He'd show students how his most memorable solos were built on rhythmic foundations, how the space between notes mattered as much as the notes themselves. He'd break down his own solos from Kiss songs, revealing the underlying rhythmic structures that made them memorable even to listeners who knew nothing about guitar technique. This was revolutionary thinking in an era when guitar virtuosity was often measured purely in notes per second. Third, and perhaps most importantly, stage presence and visual impact. Ace understood something that many technical players never grasped. Rock and roll is theater. He'd explain how he developed the Space Ace character not as a gimmick, but as a way to communicate musical ideas visually. He taught young guitarists how to make their instrument an extension of their personality, how to move on stage in ways that enhanced, rather than distracted from the music. Several of the guitarists he mentored went on to become known not just for their playing, but for their stage presence, that combination of showmanship and substance that Ace had perfected. Here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Ace never charged for these lessons. Not once. Not ever. In an industry built on transactions, where established musicians regularly charged thousands of dollars for clinics and masterclasses, Ace gave his knowledge away freely. His only requirement was that the person seeking advice had to be genuinely interested in learning, not just collecting a celebrity encounter story. He could sense the difference within 30 seconds of conversation. And if you were serious, if you asked real questions and listened to the answers, Ace would give you hours of his time without a second thought about compensation. This wasn't naive generosity or poor business sense. It was a deliberate philosophical choice rooted in Ace's own experience. When he was learning guitar in the Bronx, there were older players who had helped him, shown him chord voicings, demonstrated techniques, answered questions. Nobody charged him. Nobody asked for anything in return except that he keep learning and keep playing. That was the code, an informal apprenticeship system that existed before music schools and YouTube tutorials. Ace was maintaining that tradition, keeping it alive in an industry that was increasingly corporatized and transactional. The economic impact, though, was significant in unexpected ways. Many of the guitarists Ace helped went on to have professional careers, either as performers or teachers. They introduced students to techniques and approaches they'd learned from Ace. Those students formed bands, made records, influenced other players. It's impossible to calculate the actual reach of Ace's informal teaching, but conservative estimates suggest that his direct and indirect influence touched tens of thousands of guitarists across 3 decades. And because he never sought credit or recognition for this work, the influence spread organically, absorbed into the broader musical culture without the ego and branding that typically accompany such legacies. The lesson that almost didn't happen. One story encapsulates the entire phenomenon perfectly. 1991, Seattle, Washington. Grunge was exploding, and the musical landscape was shifting dramatically. Ace was in town for a performance, but he was also there because someone had called him. A young guitarist named Chris, who was struggling with a crisis of confidence. Chris had gotten Ace's number years earlier from another guitarist, but he'd been too intimidated to use it. Now, facing the possibility of quitting music entirely, he made the call. Ace didn't just talk to him on the phone. He invited Chris to meet him at his hotel. They sat in a hotel coffee shop for 3 hours. Ace ordered coffee after coffee, chain-smoked cigarettes, and listened to Chris explain his doubts. The grunge movement was redefining what it meant to be a rock guitarist, emphasizing raw emotion over technical proficiency. Chris, who had spent years developing his technical skills, felt obsolete. Ace's response was both simple and profound. He explained that technique wasn't the enemy of emotion. It was the tool that allowed you to express emotion more precisely. He used his own career as an example. The Space Ace persona wasn't about hiding emotion. It was about channeling it through a specific character. Chris's technical skills weren't a liability. They were assets that would allow him to express the grunge aesthetic with even more power once he understood how to integrate them. Chris didn't become famous. He didn't join a major band or sell millions of records, but he stayed in music. He formed a regional band that had a dedicated following in the Pacific Northwest. He taught guitar lessons to kids who grew up to form their own bands. And every lesson he taught, every piece of advice he gave, carried forward the philosophy Ace had shared with him in that coffee shop. Authenticity expressed through craft, emotion channeled through technique, generosity as the foundation of musical community. The full scope of Ace's teaching legacy is only now coming into focus, decades after most of these interactions occurred. In the age of social media, former students have started sharing their stories, posting about the time Ace Frehley spent an hour teaching them backstage, or the phone call that changed their approach to music. A pattern has emerged from these testimonials. Ace's teaching was never about creating clones or disciples. He encouraged each guitarist to find their own voice, to take what he taught and transform it into something personal. Several well-known guitarists have quietly acknowledged Ace's influence in recent years. In interviews and social media posts, they've mentioned lessons learned from unexpected sources, techniques picked up in chance encounters, philosophies absorbed from generous mentors. While not all of them name Ace specifically, the timeline, locations, and described teaching methods match perfectly with documented Ace appearances and known interactions. It's as if the rock guitar community has been built partially on an invisible foundation of Ace Frehley's generosity, a foundation that's only now becoming visible. What makes this legacy particularly powerful is its contrast with Ace's public image. The media narrative about Ace has often focused on his struggles with addiction, his departure from Kiss, his personal challenges. Those stories are part of his history, certainly, but they're incomplete. They miss the parallel narrative of a man who, even during his darkest periods, continued to reach out to young guitarists, continued to teach, continued to give. Several of the people Ace helped have mentioned that he taught them during periods when he was clearly struggling himself, yet he never let his personal problems interfere with his generosity toward aspiring musicians. The philosophical question this raises is profound. What defines a legacy? Is it record sales and chart positions? Awards and accolades? Or is it the influence you have on individuals, the knowledge you pass forward, the way you help others achieve their dreams? By conventional metrics, Ace Frehley is a rock legend because of his work with Kiss and his solo career. But by the metric of human impact, his legacy might be even more significant because of what he did in those backstage rooms, on those late-night phone calls, in those impromptu hotel lobby lessons. Understanding why Ace gave so freely requires understanding the man behind the Space Ace makeup. Paul Daniel Frehley grew up in a working-class Bronx neighborhood where community mattered, where people looked out for each other, where knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. His parents instilled in him the value of helping others, not for recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. When he achieved success with Kiss, those values didn't disappear. They found new expression in his interactions with aspiring musicians. There's also a creative philosophy at work here. Ace understood that music doesn't belong to individuals, it belongs to culture. Every technique he invented, every sound he created, every performance approach he developed, all of it was built on the foundation of what earlier guitarists had done. He learned from Chuck Berry, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck. They, in turn, had learned from earlier players. Music is an ongoing conversation across generations, and Ace saw himself as a link in that chain, responsible for passing knowledge forward just as it had been passed to him. In a 2014 interview, Ace touched on this philosophy briefly. He said, "I never understood guitarists who guard their secrets. What are you afraid of? That someone might play better than you? Good. That means the music gets better. That's the point." That quote encapsulates the entire ethos behind his teaching. It wasn't about ego or competition. It was about elevating the art form, improving the quality of music being made, ensuring that the next generation of guitarists had access to the knowledge and techniques that previous generations had developed. The true scope of Ace's influence will never be fully documented. Many of the guitarists he helped never became famous, never did interviews where they might mention his assistance. They're playing in bars and clubs, teaching in music stores, recording in home studios. But they're using techniques Ace taught them. They're passing on philosophies Ace shared with them. They're treating younger guitarists with the same generosity Ace showed them. The ripple effect is immeasurable, but it's real. Consider this. If Ace directly helped 300 guitarists over the course of his career, And each of those guitarists went on to teach even 10 other players. That's 3,000 guitarists carrying some element of Ace's approach. If each of those 3,000 influenced even 5 other musicians, that's 15,000 players. The numbers multiply exponentially, spreading through the musical ecosystem like beneficial bacteria, improving the overall health of rock guitar as an art form. This kind of influence doesn't appear in record sales statistics or streaming numbers. It doesn't win awards or generate headlines. But it shapes the sound of music across decades, influencing what's possible, what's attempted, what's achieved. Every guitarist who learned Ace's vibrato technique and taught it to someone else. Every player who absorbed his philosophy about tone and passed it forward. Every musician who embraced his combination of showmanship and substance. They're all part of a legacy that extends far beyond anything that can be captured in conventional measures of success. The ultimate irony is that Ace's most significant contribution to rock music might not be the songs he wrote or the solos he played, as iconic as those are. It might be the knowledge he shared, the confidence he instilled, the example he set. In an industry often characterized by ego and competition, Ace modeled something different. Generosity without expectation of return, teaching without concern for credit, sharing without fear of being surpassed. The young guitarist sitting across from Ace in that backstage room in 1979, the nervous kid on the phone in 1983, the struggling musician in the Seattle coffee shop in 1991, they all received the same gift. Not just technical knowledge, but permission to be themselves, encouragement to develop their own voice, and the understanding that success doesn't mean stepping on others, but lifting them up alongside you. Today, Ace Frehley is in his 70s, still playing, still recording, still performing, and scattered across the world are hundreds of guitarists whose lives he changed, most of whom he wouldn't recognize if he passed them on the street. They're playing his techniques in styles he never imagined. They're teaching his philosophies to students who've never heard of Kiss. They're carrying forward a legacy of generosity that transforms how we think about musical influence and artistic responsibility. The cameras never captured these moments. The magazines never reported these stories. The official histories of rock music rarely mention this chapter. But it happened, and it mattered. And it continues to matter every time a guitarist sits down with a student and says those 5 words that Ace made famous in his own quiet way. Let me show you something. That's the real legacy of Ace Frehley. Not just the space ace who conquered stadiums with smoking guitars and silver makeup, but the man who understood that true greatness isn't just about what you achieve. It's about what you help others achieve. It's about the knowledge you share, the confidence you inspire, the doors you open for those coming up behind you. It's about remembering where you came from and making sure the next generation has it a little bit easier than you did. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest solo Ace Frehley ever played. Not on stage in front of thousands, but in countless small rooms with aspiring guitarists who just needed someone to believe in them and show them the way forward.